Thank you for coming down this afternoon. It's been a crushingly difficult day for the Bailey family, as you might imagine. They haven't even buried their son, Devon, yet. His funeral is tomorrow, and there's a wake today. So they're grieving with their family and their friends today, and can't be with us. And we would ask if you would respect their privacy and their moment of grieving on this day. It's impossible for me to imagine, and probably for any of us, to imagine a more difficult set of circumstances for a family to undergo. And for today, the Colorado Springs City leaders to release the videotape which reveals the killing of Devon Malik Bailey. That video was released only a couple hours ago. I think most of you have had access to it. We were given access to it at the same time you were. So we're still studying that. We're looking at it. It's a very difficult to watch set of body cam videos. It's going to take an awful lot of analysis to get to the bottom of all of the details. My name is Daryl Kilmer, and along with Mari Newman, our law firm Kilmer, Lane & Newman represents the Bailey family. We're trying to guide them through this very difficult legal process, as well as the personal circumstances that they're confronted with these days. The police of Colorado Springs shot Mr. Bailey in the back multiple times. 4 times probably is the best evidence. The autopsy hasn't been released, and the city of Colorado Springs has still not released most of the evidence of its investigation. They released some 911 dispatch tapes and some body-worn camera footage, but there's an awful lot still unknown that we'll still have to analyze. From what we do know, from what we've learned from some of the body-worn camera and also some private footage that was released earlier last week, we know that Mr. Bailey was trying desperately to flee from the police, and he did not have a weapon in his hand and had not shown any weapon when he was shot in the back and killed, shot multiple times. The police appear to argue that they shot Mr. Bailey because they feared that he was going for a gun at the time. We think the video shows otherwise. The video shows that he was doing everything within his power in the 6 or 8 or 10 steps that he could take to get away, to in fact get away. That was what he was doing. The law, ever since the 1985 Supreme Court pronouncement on this issue, has been very clear that police don't have an unlimited right to use their guns to apprehend people. That's called using deadly force. A weapon, for obvious reasons, such as a gun, is deadly force. And the Constitution of the United States of America, as well as the laws of the state of Colorado, some of the laws that Colorado Springs put into the materials that they released today, strictly circumscribe when police can shoot a felon to apprehend him. The law says clearly that the officer must be in immediate fear, have probable cause to believe there's an immediate risk of death or serious bodily injury to the officer or to somebody else. And we can all imagine several circumstances where an officer might have a sincere concern for the safety of a community. Even in this case, there could be a sincere concern for the safety of the community. But that is not the legal standard that officers are held to. Officers are trained to be restraint on their use of force and to use less than deadly force, except when it's absolutely necessary to stop imminent death or serious bodily injury. And in this instance, the video shows that there was no evidence to support that anybody was imminently at risk of being killed or harmed. A good contrast, sadly, is the shootings that we experienced also on August 3rd, the same day that Mr. Bailey was killed in Dayton, Ohio. In that instance, police were confronted with a shooter who had shot several people and had shown every indication that he was going to shoot more people, that third parties and police officers were imminently at risk unless this person could be stopped, and thus they used deadly force, and they did so appropriately. It is that kind of situation, when you have probable cause to believe that somebody's about to be hurt, that's the only time the police can use deadly force. And in this case, there's no evidence that Devon was about to hurt anybody. The evidence is to the contrary. He was trying to flee the situation and to get away from any sort of official apprehension or arrest or anything of that nature. The fact that there are other people around is does not meet the legal standard of imminent risk of death or serious bodily injury. And if that's how the evidence plays out in this case, then in fact this is an unconstitutional and an illegal shooting. It's excessive force under the Constitution. Now one might say, but what if the suspected criminal gets away? And that is what the Supreme Court has instructed us time and time again, that under our system of freedoms, under the Fourth Amendment to the United States Constitution, which says that police officers are not allowed to constitutionally apprehend people in an unreasonable way, that you cannot have an unreasonable seizure of a person or an arrest of a person. We've learned from the Supreme Court teachings and the laws that have been passed that the price we pay for that type of freedom is from time to time a suspect might escape. In this case, it wasn't a terribly difficult thing to do afterwards. They knew who the suspect was, they knew where he lived, and if he escaped that situation, then they could apprehend him at his house or later on. And that is what our system tells us, that that's the way the police are instructed to act in this case. Of course, we're going to be analyzing the videos, as I'm sure a lot of you will too, and the community will too. We're not here to say that being a policeman is an easy job. It's not. It's a very difficult job, and it's fraught with dangers. We're very aware of that. But this is why we have training. And Colorado Springs has a history of this type of violence, frequently leading to death against residents of the community and others. And training must teach that use of a deadly force, of a gun, to apprehend somebody who's merely a suspect, and far different from a situation such as Dayton, Ohio. There's no evidence that Devon Bailey was intending to hurt anybody else if he got away. The law requires less than lethal force to apprehend him, and instead we've lost a 19-year-old young man who had no criminal record, had no convictions in his past, and his family has lost a loved one. I'm going to defer to my partner, Maury Newman.
Actually, I think you've covered it.
Oh, we're happy to answer any questions.
We'll
you
answer
have.
questions.
When do you suspect the investigation from the Fourth Judicial? Did they talk to you about when they'll be giving you an answer on what's going to happen to the police officers?
The question is whether they've talked to us about the next steps in for the Fourth Judicial District Attorney's Office or otherwise, and the answer is no. They haven't talked to us or kept us apprised of anything that's going to be happening. As indicated, we received the video at exactly the same time you did, as far as we can tell. We don't know what the next steps are. As you may know, the family is calling for an independent investigation rather than merely sliding this over to the El Paso County Attorney's Office to investigate. It's a system that is fraught with conflicts of interest if the El Paso County Sheriff's Department get to investigate the Colorado Springs Police Department when there's a death at the hands of Colorado Springs Police, and the Colorado Springs Police Department gets to investigate the El Paso County Sheriff's Office when there's a death, as there has been, up at the jail or by the Sheriff's Department. You hand off the investigation to your friends and things come out okay. This is why we almost never see any prosecutorial decisions, any decisions to prosecute somebody who has killed a member of the community. We're calling for an independent investigation. We believe that independence can best be achieved by turning this matter over to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation to investigate rather than the El Paso County Sheriff's Department, and then to the Colorado Attorney General's office to make an independent prosecutorial decision as to whether charges against the officers are warranted and what those charges would be. Only in this way can the community have confidence that this has been a fair investigation. And it's better for the police this way too. Consider if their friends decide not to prosecute based upon a friendly investigation, what kind of trust can the community have in the legitimacy of that investigation? If they're truly interested in clearing their names from any assumption of wrongdoing, then they should be happy to turn the investigation over to a highly qualified and professional team of investigators at the Colorado Bureau of Investigation. We haven't had a response from Colorado Springs on this. I'm not optimistic that they'll agree to do this. Why is that? Because if your friends are investigating you, then you're more likely to come out well in the investigation.
What do you say to people watching that video who say a police officer had to make a split-second decision, perhaps thought he saw the suspect reaching for a gun that he did in fact have?
Yes, there are split-second decisions that have to be made by police officers, and this is very difficult. And we've learned through experience and through history that it is during these moments of split-second decisions that training is most acutely important. How have they been trained to handle these foreseeable circumstances that admittedly have an awful lot of it's scary. There's not a lot of time to second guess. So the more you are trained as how you'll respond in such a situation, the better it will be. Now, I predict that the Colorado Springs Police Department will say, this is standard operating procedure. The way these officers responded is standard operating procedure. The reason I predict that isn't because it's standard operating procedure, it's because that's what police departments always say when their officers have killed somebody. But it shouldn't be standard operating procedure. There has to be very specific evidence present, not just a sincere concern, but evidence to provide probable cause of imminent death or serious bodily injury, not just a possibility that somebody might get hurt if Mr. Bailey escaped. That's the difference, and that's where the law comes in.
Let me add one thing to that, if I might. I think it's easy when you're looking at a video and slowing it down in slow motion and focusing on particular areas to perceive it in a way that is not consistent with the way it was in the moment. But one thing we know about how it was in the moment is what we've heard from multiple independent third-party witnesses. And these include members of the active military who, to a person, said that what they perceived was that there was no justification for the police officers to have shot Mr. Bailey in the back as he ran away from them. And so what we heard from people who were perceiving it in the moment, making the same split-second observations, is that they believed that it was an outrageous and unjustified use of excessive force and execution of a man who was running away.
As you indicated, it was a split-second decision. It's going to be analyzed very carefully. Could the officer who fired his weapon have seen Mr. Bailey's hands in front of him after refusing to be searched for a weapon and instead running away, have interpreted that as a threat?
It's impossible for us to know what was in the officer's head. We haven't seen the police reports filled out by the officers. We haven't seen any interviews, which undoubtedly have been taken and hopefully videotaped during this investigation. So for us to speculate exactly what was in his head, I think might even be reckless. So could somebody have seen that Mr. Bailey, when he was actually holding his basketball shorts up, was going for a weapon? I suppose that's conceivable. The question is, was it reasonable? Did he have evidence to believe that there was a gun that's going to cause death or serious bodily injury imminently? And we think there wasn't such evidence. We acknowledge that there might have been concern, but that's where the law differs from the rest of us might be walking around saying, better not take any chances. Officers have taken an oath to support and enforce the Constitution, and they know that it's an unreasonable seizure, an unreasonable arrest of a person to simply shoot them because they fear something bad might be happening if they get away.
How about his criminal record? You touched on that. He was just an adult for a couple of years now. You said he had no convictions, none at all?
No convictions, that's correct.
What about arrests?
I don't know the extent of any sort of arrest. I know of a couple of charges that had been brought a few years earlier. He was only 19, so a few years earlier might have been when he was 16 or 17, but those were dismissed by the district attorney voluntarily. There were no convictions on Mr. Bailey's record.
Bouncing off of that, nobody wants to be arrested, but some critics will say, why run in the first place? Why not stay and talk? And I know you can't be in his head either, but maybe respond to that criticism of, why didn't he want to be arrested? Why wouldn't he stay? Why did he take off?
One might ask, why would somebody in Devon Bailey's shoes run under those circumstances? And what we're talking about is a 19-year-old young man who we now know had a weapon, and he knew that he shouldn't have a weapon. It's not irrelevant either that he's a young African-American man. There have been recent court cases, even. Court of Appeals, the second highest court in the land of the Ninth Circuit and also the Seventh Circuit, that have explained very insightfully that being an African-American young man is a different perspective than I might have or than you might have. And many have been taught or have learned from experience and what they've read that when there are police around and you're a young African-American man, you're probably better off somewhere else. Now, that's speculation as to whether that's what Devon thought or not. But it wouldn't surprise me one bit that he knew, he believed, that he would be much better off not in that interaction, even if they came and arrested him later at his house. But we do know that fleeing from police is not a capital offense. There is no legitimate death penalty for simply running from the police. And what turns out to be bad judgment of a young man in that circumstance cost him his life. And the fact that we might all say that policing is a difficult job isn't good enough to defend a unconstitutional killing of a young man.
And one more question for you. We talk about how police say in that video that they found a gun and they're trying to remove it. Does that make a difference to you? You had this long explanation earlier about, you know, imminent or not. So to critics who would say they found a gun.
Well, for example, if Mr. Bailey had pulled a gun on the police, then what's in their mind at the time they're shooting is he pulled a gun on us, so there would be an imminence of the fear of death or serious bodily injury. They would have had to see this. Of course, that didn't happen. There's no evidence at all that Mr. Bailey ever touched the gun that was deep within his basketball shorts, way down low. So that's not the situation. If they would have seen a gun, then yes, I agree with you. It might be a different case, but they did not.
You said you aren't sure yet what the next steps are. Do we know if the Fourth Judicial even has this case yet? If it's still under investigation?
Well, normally the next steps would be that the investigation by an agency that's investigating would turn it over to a prosecutorial authority to make a prosecution decision. In this case, it's really difficult to tell how that's working because what we received and what you all received is some evidence from the Colorado Springs Police Department, the city of Colorado Springs. On the other hand, we were told last week that they were turning the investigation over to the El Paso County Sheriff's Department. Now, we think those two agencies are hand in glove, but at least technically they're different agencies, and we didn't receive anything from the investigation of the El Paso County Sheriff's Department. So I believe the next steps will be, I think, that they will finish the El Paso County Sheriff's Department investigation and turn it over to a prosecutorial authority, probably the 4th Judicial District. Colorado Springs is in the jurisdiction of that district. But we think that's a bad way to do it. We think they should turn the investigation over to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation rather than the El Paso County Sheriff's Department, at which time the Colorado Bureau of Investigation should turn it over to the Colorado Attorney General's office to make an independent prosecutorial decision. And we think it would be wise also for the Colorado Attorney General prosecutorial function to impanel a grand jury to evaluate the evidence. This would be a process where citizens have a participation role based upon a prosecutor's laying out of the evidence as to whether or not criminal charges should be brought. We think that best would ensure the independence and impartiality of this investigation. We hold little hope that this is the way they're going to do it, however. We fear that it's going to be a much more opaque investigation with the window blinds pulled down, and they'll pull it back when they're ready to announce that they're not charging anybody with anything.
What was not released today that you think would be valuable and that you want to see to get a clear picture of what happened?
The question is what was not released, and of course, we don't know what we don't know. We do know there were at least 3 officers on the scene, and what was released was 2 versions of the body cam. What we do know is that there were multiple witnesses, 10, maybe 15 witnesses out on the street that were watching this. This was in the middle of the afternoon on a summer evening. There was a barbecue going on. There was a child's birthday party going on. There were people milling around in their front yards. What we have not received are the results of any of the city's investigation regarding what those witnesses saw. Now, we've talked to several of those witnesses, and as Ms. Newman pointed out, those witnesses watched it in real time too. They didn't have to make a split-second shooting decision, but they testified to a person that there was nothing that Devon did that was a threat toward the officers or to anybody else. He was merely trying to flee. Those witnesses' testimonies should be heard too, and we'd like to see, I presume the city has even more evidence of that nature that they haven't showed us, so I'm not sure everything that they haven't turned over.
Do you know at all if the officers that were involved were placed on leave or?
We've been told that the two officers, I believe they're the two that we did receive a body cam for, have been put on leave during this investigation. We're not even sure how many officers shot their weapons. We believe it was at least two, possibly three. This based upon not only the evidence that was released today, but also the independent witness statements that we've obtained. We'd like to know that too. I mean, how many shots were shot, how many guns were used in these shootings. We believe the consensus of the evidence that we've talked to independent witnesses that about 7 shots were fired. We also believe, based upon an analysis of some of the video, that at least 2, maybe 3 shots missed Devon, and that you can even see in the video that was released last week some of those striking the ground, which were errant shots by these officers. And by the way, these officers were shooting at Devon, but there were children playing in the park further up, and we believe that this was obviously never even considered by the officers in their haste to shoot and to stop Devon. But that type of apprehension is exceedingly dangerous to the innocent bystanders around there, and of course all shots were fired by police, none of them by anybody else.
Have you said where he got his gun?
I haven't said where he got it, I don't know.
And you don't know where, do you know if it was registered to anybody besides him or different?
I don't have that information.
And then you mentioned that your opinion is that Colorado Springs has a history of incidents that end in death. Could you elaborate on that, please, and tell us what you mean by that and what other incidents you're referencing?
Our office alone has represented several families in Colorado Springs who have suffered serious injury and oftentimes death. Currently, we represent the family of Jeffrey Melvin, who in 2018 was killed by the Colorado Springs Police Department. He was actually tased to death. He was tased multiple times. And he had committed no crime whatsoever. They were just chasing him because he was another young African-American male who, when he saw police, he became afraid and he ran, and they tased him to death. And that's excessive force as well. The El Paso County Sheriff's Department killed Doremus Lemuel at the jail, and he had undergone a mental health crisis, it appears, so he was a bit non-compliant up at the jail. Obviously he was unarmed, he wasn't hurting anybody, but the sheriff's deputies piled on top of him and crushed him to death. He died under a pile of deputies, much reminiscent of the Denver death of street preacher Marvin Booker at the Denver jail a few years ago. Those are just 2 examples of, and of course they hand it off to each other to investigate themselves, and then they decide that nobody will be charged with anything.
Did you say earlier that he knew, or you presume he knew he shouldn't have had a gun, and if that's the case, what was the reason that he shouldn't have had a gun if he's a 19-year-old without any convictions?
I do not know what Devon was thinking, actually, and I think it's probably not responsible for me to speculate what he's thinking. I can imagine, I have 18-year-old and a 20-year-old kids myself, and I can say that they're not always making the best decisions, and in that moment of fear and concern, I can imagine why somebody would want to flee. I don't know what Devon was thinking, so it's wrong of me to speculate on that.
Are you sure that Devon and the man he was with are the 2 who had committed the attempted robbery or robbery that happened earlier?
We're not sure of that, no.
Because he didn't say that wasn't his nickname.
Well, I mean,
it might very well be that he is, but have the police, is that something else you'd like to know?
of course, yes. We'd like to see all of the investigation Colorado Springs has, and we are continuing to conduct our own investigation into the facts too, talking to as many witnesses as we can to try to get as much information for the family and for the community that we can in this case. But there's a lot that we don't know
Have
yet.
you talked to the original guy who made the 911 call?
No, and I can say this, Devon's friend was charged with a low-level misdemeanor assault, 3rd-degree assault, not with armed robbery. The person who had called in on 911 had said that they stole his wallet and they stole his money, but obviously Devon was killed and they searched him and there was no wallet or money on him, and they arrested at the exact same time Devon's friend who was there, and there was no wallet and no money, which is why the police didn't charge them with armed robbery. There was no evidence to support the 911 call that there had been armed robbery. Rather, it appears, and I'm not 100% confident on this, but it appears that there had been essentially a fist fight between the fellow who called 911, maybe to get revenge, and the friend of Devon's. There was a fist fight that didn't go well for the reporter, is what we've been told, and that's what maybe motivated that call. Obviously, we're still looking into these things to get to the bottom
Are
of
you
all of it.
working with that second young man and his family at all, or just Devon's?
We don't represent that.
Is his name Lawrence?
Yes.
Okay.
By the way, our co-counsel in this case is attorney Dan Kay, and he's in Colorado Springs. And he's, he couldn't, given the circumstances, he couldn't be up here today. And he's also with the family today, and essentially consoling them and trying the best he can to have them be allowed their time and space to grieve, given that the funeral is tomorrow and the wake is today. It's very difficult. Any other questions? All right. Thank you for coming down.